March 1943, Berlin. Inside a quiet wood-paneled office, a German admiral held a single sheet of paper that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wasn't describing a new superweapon or a secret army. It was describing a factory. An American factory an ocean away that was projected to produce a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men running the Third Reich, this was laughable propaganda. But to the spies who risked everything to gather this intelligence, it was something far more terrifying. It was a death sentence written in numbers, and the men in power refused to read it. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was not like the fanatics surrounding Adolf Hitler. As head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he dealt in facts, not fantasies. He was an old-school professional, a career naval officer who understood that modern warfare wasn't just about brave soldiers and brilliant generals. It was about steel, oil, aluminum, production capacity. His network of agents stretched across the globe, gathering intelligence from neutral countries, intercepting communications, building a picture of what Germany was truly up against. By early 1943, the picture was becoming clear, and it was absolutely terrifying. The disaster at Stalingrad had shaken the German military to its core. The Soviets were pushing back with brutal force. In North Africa, American and British forces were crushing Rommel's Afrika Korps. But at the very top, a dangerous delusion persisted. Hitler believed victory was simply a matter of willpower. German soldiers were superior. German science was unbeatable. Destiny was on their side. Canaris knew better. The numbers told a different story. The intelligence didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. A businessman returning from America spoke of a factory so vast it had its own weather patterns inside. A diplomat in Washington reported production targets that seemed to have an extra zero. A Swedish engineer sent coded messages about an aircraft assembly line moving with the speed of automobile manufacturing. Individually, each report could be dismissed. But together, they formed a terrifying pattern. They all pointed to one place in Michigan called Willow Run. And they all made the same unbelievable claim. The Ford Motor Company was building B-24 Liberator heavy bombers using mass production techniques. The goal was one bomber every single hour. To the German mind, this was simply impossible. A B-24 was an 18-ton monster with over 1.5 million individual parts. German factories, supposedly the finest in Europe, took weeks or even months to produce a comparable heavy bomber. If the Americans could actually pull this off, one bomber an hour meant 24 a day, over 700 a month. From one factory, Canaris did the math. If these numbers were real, Germany had already lost. Half a world away, the impossible was becoming very real. On a stretch of Michigan farmland, a monster had risen from the earth. The Willow Run bomber plant was the physical embodiment of what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main building stretched for over half a mile. It was called the most enormous room in the history of man. The assembly line famously had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn because the factory crossed county lines. Rather than pay taxes in two different counties, Ford installed giant turntables that rotated partially built bombers around the bend. Workers called it the tax turn. But the real revolution wasn't the building itself. It was what happened inside. Henry Ford and his production chief Charles Sorensen had made an arrogant promise. They would build airplanes the same way they built Model T automobiles. The old guard of the aircraft industry laughed at them. "You cannot expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," one executive sneered. Ford proved them all wrong. They broke the B-24 down into manageable subassemblies. Each worker was trained for one single repetitive task. One person drilled holes. Another riveted panels. Over and over. The plant's apprentice school churned out thousands of new workers every week. Raw materials flowed in one end. 18-ton bombers rolled out the other. And who exactly were these workers building the weapons that would destroy the Third Reich? They were a direct contradiction of everything Nazi ideology claimed about the world. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly a third of them were women. The iconic Rosie the Riveters who operated rivet guns and welding torches with precision and speed. One of these women, Roswell Monroe, became the real-life inspiration for the famous propaganda character. Over 9% of the workforce was African American. Another 3% were classified as disabled. All of them working side by side, 6 days a week, in rotating shifts that kept the factory humming 24 hours a day. This was the very society Hitler loved to mock. A chaotic, racially mixed democracy that supposedly lacked discipline and martial spirit. And they were about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied comprehension. The early days were rough. The plant earned the nickname Willow Run because of production struggles. But as 1943 progressed, the machine found its rhythm. America was perfecting its most devastating weapon. Not a bomb, not a tank, the assembly line. Armed with this terrifying intelligence, Admiral Canaris faced his greatest challenge, getting the truth past the wall of arrogance surrounding the Nazi leadership. That wall had a name: Hermann Göring. The Reichsmarshal was head of the Luftwaffe and fancied himself the ultimate authority on air power. He was also profoundly corrupt and massively egotistical. When Canaris presented the Abwehr findings on Willow Run, Göring did not react with concern. He laughed. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he sneered. "They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." This was not just a throwaway insult. It was the Nazi worldview in a single sentence. To them, Americans were shopkeepers, a decadent consumer society, a mongrel race lacking the discipline of the German people. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce heavy bombers was simply unthinkable. Göring dismissed the reports as clumsy propaganda. Accepting them would mean admitting his own intelligence had missed the most critical development of the war. It would mean admitting his Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies. His ego would not allow it. Getting past Göring was one thing. Reaching Hitler was another. In the Führer's headquarters, reality was whatever Adolf Hitler decreed it to be. Military briefings were less about strategy and more about reinforcing whatever delusion he wanted to believe. His view of America was a bizarre mix of contempt and paranoia. He saw it as a mongrel nation crippled by racial impurity and controlled by Jewish financiers. When confronted with the Abwehr production figures, Hitler reacted with pure venom. The numbers were inflated fantasies. Jewish propaganda. His own armaments minister Albert Speer later admitted in Allied interrogations that he knew if the Willow Run numbers were even half accurate, Germany was finished. But saying that to Hitler in 1943 would have been career-ending at best. So the confrontation never happened. Fact collided with dogma. And in the Third Reich, dogma always won. The men who brought the truth were labeled defeatists. Their patriotism was questioned. A single piece of paper representing the dangerous work of dozens of spies was brushed aside. The decision was made not by order, but by stubborn refusal. The fate of millions was sealed. The consequences arrived first as a distant rumble, then as a roar that filled the skies over Germany. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became an unstoppable flood. The prophecy of Willow Run was coming true. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out assault on the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, many from Willow Run, pounded factories across the Reich. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its homeland and was systematically destroyed. For every German fighter shot down, there was only a trickle of replacements. For every American plane lost, 10 more were crossing the Atlantic. It was brutal arithmetic, exactly what Canaris had foreseen. The cities Göring had promised would never be bombed were reduced to rubble. One Luftwaffe general wrote in his diary that Göring still insisted the Americans could not have built so many aircraft. Even as 1,000 bombers darkened the sky over Germany, the B-24s rolling out of Michigan were deconstructing the Third Reich piece by piece. Factories shattered, railways torn apart, oil refineries obliterated. The German war machine starved of fuel and ground to a halt. What happened to the man who tried to warn them? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of truth was steep. His accurate reports marked him as someone not to be trusted. In Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist sounded like being a traitor. His rivals in the SS saw the Abwehr as a nest of old-world aristocrats lacking true Nazi fervor. They watched him constantly, waiting for a mistake. His opposition ran deeper than intelligence reports. Horrified by SS atrocities, he used his position to shield members of the German resistance. He secretly worked to prevent Spain from joining the Axis. After the failed July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, the Gestapo investigation uncovered connections to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries revealed the true depth of his opposition. On April 9, 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the war, the order came from Hitler himself. At Flossenburg concentration camp, Wilhelm Canaris was stripped and slowly strangled. He was eliminated by the very regime he had tried to save from its own blindness. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the final numbers proved exactly how right he had been. At its absolute peak, Willow Run produced a B-24 Liberator not every hour, but every 63 minutes. By the time the last plane rolled off the line, Ford had built 6,972 complete bombers at that single facility. The United States produced over 18,400 B-24s total. Over 300,000 military aircraft between 1940 and 1945. Germany produced around 94,000 in the same period. The German failure was not a failure of intelligence. Their spies did their job. The failure was a failure of acceptance. A total cognitive collapse at the highest levels. An inability to process facts that contradicted fanatical ideology. They were defeated not by a secret weapon but by simple arithmetic. Buried by an avalanche of steel forged by the very people they had mocked as inferior. The diverse workforce of Willow Run became a monument to everything Nazism tried to destroy. The power of a free society to mobilize and achieve the impossible. March 1943 was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and nobody in power was willing to listen.